Alice Larman stood at the window of her $12,000 penthouse. Watching Manila's dawn paint the city in shades of gold, she bought 1,000 times over an art she never looked at. Her coffee cost more than a street vendor earned in a week. Her diamond-encrusted watch sat beside a laptop, displaying numbers that shifted faster than heartbeats, each flicker representing fortunes most Filipinos would never touch. She built an empire moving goods across oceans for $0.7 billion in logistics that connected the world's wealthy to more wealth. But that morning, staring at her own reflection ghost-like in the glass, Alice felt the weight of a question that had been suffocating her for months. When people looked at someone with nothing, did they see a soul or did they see empty space? She'd planned this experiment obsessively, worked through every detail, prepared herself mentally, yet standing there, watching the city wake to struggles she'd never known, she wondered if she had the courage to become invisible. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it proves that powerful stories resonate everywhere. Alice had been thinking about this experiment for 6 months. It started after a board meeting in Singapore, where she'd watched a colleague step over a homeless man as if he were a piece of discarded furniture. The man had reached out, not aggressively, just a small gesture in need, and her colleague had simply adjusted his path by 6 inches and continued his conversation about quarterly projections. Alice remembered feeling something crack inside her that day. She'd spent 45 years building an empire based on efficiency, on moving things from point A to point B with maximum speed and minimum waste. She understood supply chains and logistics. She understood profit margins and market shares. But she realized that morning in Singapore that she didn't understand people at all. The question haunted her. She'd grown up with money, inherited her father's shipping company, and multiplied it tenfold through ruthless intelligence and strategic acquisitions. She'd never been poor. She'd never even been middle class. Her entire existence had been cushioned by wealth so substantial it felt like gravity, always there, invisible, holding everything in place. She moved through the world in first-class cabins and private cars, in penthouses and boardrooms, surrounded by people who smiled and agreed and treated her like she mattered immensely. But what if all of that was stripped away? What if she became one of the invisible people she saw from her car window, the ones who cleaned streets and begged at intersections and slept on cardboard? Would anyone see her then? Would anyone care? Alice turned from the window and looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror. She was 45 but looked younger, maintained by personal trainers and dermatologists, and a lifestyle that never required physical struggle. Her hair was professionally colored, her skin smooth, her body fit. She wore silk pajamas that cost $800. Even in sleep clothes, she looked wealthy. The question was, could she make herself look poor? Could she transform so completely that her own social class wouldn't recognize her? She'd spent months researching this. She'd studied method acting techniques, read accounts of journalists who'd gone undercover in poverty, even consulted with a theatrical makeup artist under pretense of funding a documentary. She'd learned that true poverty wasn't just about dirty clothes. It was about the body language of defeat, the particular way sun and manual labor aged skin, the look in the eyes of someone who'd stopped expecting kindness. She'd learned that the wealthy could always spot their own kind, even in disguise, because wealth left markers that were hard to erase. Good teeth, confident posture, the assumption of welcome. But Alice was determined. She'd already purchased the clothes from a street vendor in Tonda, paying 5 times what they were worth and confusing the seller completely. The clothes were genuinely worn, genuinely dirty, genuinely marked by the kind of poverty she needed to embody. She'd hidden them in a storage unit across the city, along with the other elements of her transformation. She'd mapped out her route, chosen her locations, prepared her methodology. She was treating this like a business project because that was the only way she knew how to approach anything. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. She would transform herself into a poor woman and spend one day on the streets of Manila. She would start in Bonifacio Global City, the gleaming financial district where her own company had offices, where the wealthy shopped and dined and conducted their elevated lives. Then she would move to humbler neighborhoods, places where poverty and wealth brushed against each other. She would observe. She would note who helped and who ignored her. She would find the answer to her question. Did people see humanity in the poor, or did they see nothing at all? Alice checked her watch. It was 6:47 a.m. She had 3 hours before she needed to begin. 3 hours to commit to this insanity or back out completely. She could call her assistant. Say she was taking a personal day. Stay in this penthouse and forget the whole thing. She could go back to her comfortable ignorance, her cushioned existence. The thought was tempting, but she knew she wouldn't. The question had hooked itself too deeply into her mind. She needed to know. She needed to understand, even if the answer terrified her. The transformation took place in a bathroom at a storage facility Alice rented under a false name in Mandaluyong. She'd chosen this location carefully, far enough from her usual sphere that no one would recognize her, anonymous enough that the staff barely looked up when she entered. The facility was the kind of place where people stored things they wanted to forget. Old furniture, failed businesses, lives that didn't work out. Alice thought it was fitting that she would store her own identity here, at least temporarily. She locked herself in the small bathroom and began the process of becoming nobody. First, she removed everything that marked her as wealthy. The watch came off first, slipping easily from her wrist. She placed it in a small safe she installed in her storage unit. Then the wedding ring. She was divorced, but still wore it on her right hand out of habit. The diamond earrings, the Cartier bracelet, the Hermes bag. Layer by layer, she peeled away her identity. Next came the clothes. She stripped off her designer workout gear and stood naked in the harsh fluorescent light. Her body looked vulnerable, unmarked by struggle. She thought about how bodies told stories. Hers told a story of privilege, of personal trainers and organic food, and time to exercise. She wondered if that story would show through her disguise. The clothes she'd purchased were folded in a plastic bag. She pulled them out, wrinkling her nose at the smell, sweat and street dust, and something indefinably sad. There was a long skirt, faded and stained, the kind sold in second-hand markets. A loose blouse that had once been white, but had grayed with age and washing. A thin cardigan with pulls in the fabric. Everything was slightly too large, giving her the appearance of someone who'd lost weight, someone worn down by circumstances. She dressed slowly, adjusting to the feel of fabric that wasn't soft, that didn't breathe, that scratched against her skin. The clothes felt heavy with meaning, with the lives of whoever had worn them before. She wondered about those previous owners. Where were they now? Had they moved up or further down? Had they escaped poverty or been consumed by it? The physical transformation was next, and this was where Alice had to be most careful. Poverty aged people. It marked them in specific ways. She'd studied photographs, watched documentaries, observed people on the streets for months. She knew what she needed to do. She took a makeup sponge and began applying a foundation several shades darker than her natural skin, working it into her face and neck and hands. She added dark circles under her eyes with eyeshadow, deepening them until she looked exhausted. She used eyeliner to create fine lines around her eyes and mouth, aging herself 10 years. She rubbed brown eyeshadow into the creases of her hands, making them look weathered and worked. Her hair was next. She pulled it back severely, dampening it with water until it looked unwashed and greasy. She wrapped it in a faded scarf, the kind she'd seen women wear at markets. The effect was transformative. The woman in the mirror no longer looked like Alice Larman, billionaire. She looked like someone forgettable, someone the world had passed by. But the final touch was the most important. The dirt. Alice had brought street dirt in a plastic container, actual grime from Manila's sidewalks. She rubbed it into her skin, under her fingernails, into the fabric of her clothes. She rubbed it into her feet and legs, into her arms, into every exposed surface. The dirt was crucial. It was a marker that told people she lived on streets, that she had nowhere to wash, that cleanliness was a luxury she couldn't afford. When she was finished, Alice stood back and looked at herself in the mirror. The transformation was complete and shocking. She didn't recognize herself. The woman staring back at her looked defeated, forgotten, invisible. She looked exactly like the people she passed in her car every day without seeing. She looked like nothing. Alice felt something strange in her chest. Not quite fear, not quite excitement. A mixture of both, perhaps a sense that she was about to learn something she couldn't unlearn. She packed her real clothes and jewelry into the safe, locked it, and checked the time. It was 9:43 a.m. The wealthy would be out now, shopping and brunching in Bonifacio, Global City. It was time to test her theory. She left the storage facility and walked to the nearest bus stop. Normally, she traveled by private car, insulated from the reality of public transportation. But today she was poor, and poor people took buses. She waited at the stop alongside others, noticing for the first time how people arrange themselves, unconsciously creating hierarchies even here, in this small democracy of the bus stop. The better-dressed people stood slightly apart. The laborers in dirty clothes clustered together, and Alice, in her disguise, found herself naturally gravitating toward the edges, the space where people who didn't quite belong ended up. The bus arrived and Alice climbed aboard, paying her fare with small bills she'd exchanged specifically for this purpose. She found a seat near the back and watched Manila pass by the window. From this vantage point, the city looked different, less polished, more real. She saw things she'd never noticed from her car. The complexity of the street life, the vendors and children and workers, the whole ecosystem of survival that existed outside her air-conditioned bubble. As the bus rumbled toward Bonifacio, Global City, Alice felt her heart rate increasing. She was nervous. Actually nervous. When was the last time she'd felt this? Maybe never. Her life had been so controlled, so managed, so predictable. But this was unknown territory. She was about to test whether her own social class would recognize her humanity or treat her like furniture. The bus stopped at the corner of 5th Avenue and 26th Street. Alice got off and stood on the sidewalk, looking at the gleaming towers of BGC. This was her world, or it had been. She'd had lunch in that restaurant yesterday. Her office was 6 blocks away. She'd walked these streets 1,000 times in designer heels and tailored suits. But now, standing here in rags and dirt, everything looked different. The buildings seemed taller, more imposing. The people seemed more beautiful and more cruel. And Alice felt, for the first time in her privileged life, genuinely afraid. Listen, if you're still here, it means you're invested. You want to see what happens next. But here's the reality. Most people watch stories like this and scroll away without subscribing. They enjoy it, then vanish. If this story actually matters to you, if you genuinely care about how it ends, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Otherwise, you'll probably forget this channel exists and miss all the other incredible stories I share. The first hour in Bonifacio, Global City taught Alice something she'd never understood from the comfort of her penthouse. Invisibility was a physical experience. It wasn't metaphorical or abstract. It was real and brutal and exhausting. She started by simply standing on the corner of High Street, the outdoor shopping plaza where Manila's wealthy came to browse designer stores and eat expensive brunches. She positioned herself near the entrance to a luxury boutique, not begging, not speaking, just existing in the space. And what she discovered was that existing while poor required enormous energy because people actively erased you from their vision. The first woman who passed was wearing Chanel sunglasses identical to a pair Alice owned. She was perhaps 40, perfectly groomed, carrying shopping bags from stores Alice frequented. The woman approached the boutique entrance, and Alice stood just slightly in her path, not blocking it, just occupying space that required minor adjustment. The woman's eyes swept over Alice without pausing, without acknowledgement, without any indication that she'd registered another human being. She simply adjusted her trajectory by 12 inches and continued walking, her expression never changing. Alice felt the rejection like a physical blow. She'd expected to be ignored, but she hadn't anticipated how it would feel. The complete absence of recognition. The way the woman's eyes had moved across her, without catching, as if Alice were air or shadow. More people passed. A businessman in a suit that cost at least $3,000, speaking into a phone about merger negotiations. A group of young women laughing about someone's birthday party. A couple holding hands, talking about where to eat lunch. Not one of them looked at Alice. Not one of them acknowledged her presence. She was a ghost among the living. After 30 minutes, Alice's feet began to hurt. She'd worn cheap rubber slippers as part of her disguise, and they provided no cushioning against the concrete. Her feet throbbed. She shifted her weight, trying to find relief, and realized this was something poor people dealt with constantly. The physical pain of poverty, the way it manifested in feet and backs and joints. Comfort was a luxury. Rest was a luxury. Everything her body took for granted was actually a product of her wealth. The sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive. Alice felt sweat gathering under her clothes, mixing with the dirt she'd applied, creating an authentic griminess that made her skin itch. She wanted water but had intentionally brought none. Poor people didn't always have access to water. She wanted to sit, but there was nowhere to sit. The benches were occupied by shoppers resting between purchases, and Alice instinctively knew that sitting there in her state would trigger immediate security response. By the second hour, Alice was genuinely suffering. The heat was relentless, beating down from a cloudless sky and reflecting off the glass buildings. Her head ached. Her mouth was dry. Her feet felt like they were on fire. She moved to a shaded area near a coffee shop where she could smell the espresso and pastries, and the contrast between her physical misery and the comfortable lives happening 10 feet away was almost unbearable. A man in his 50s emerged from the coffee shop, carrying a venti latte that cost more than Alice's entire outfit. He wore cologne that Alice recognized. She bought the same scent for a business associate last Christmas. The man walked directly toward where Alice stood, and for a moment she thought he would speak to her, acknowledge her, something. But he simply sidestepped her presence and continued on his way, talking into his Bluetooth earpiece about golf handicaps. Alice felt tears stinging her eyes and was horrified by her own reaction. She was emotional. She, who never cried in board meetings or negotiations, was on the verge of breaking down after 2 hours of being ignored. But it wasn't just the ignoring. It was the specific quality of it. The way her own social class, the people who wore her cologne and shopped at her stores and lived in her world, treated her like she fundamentally didn't matter, like she was less than human. She thought about all the times she'd walked past homeless people without seeing them, all the times she'd stepped around someone begging without breaking stride, all the times she'd been annoyed by poverty's intrusion into her field of vision. And now she understood what she'd been doing. She hadn't been ignoring people. She'd been erasing them. There was a difference. Ignoring implied they existed, but you chose not to engage. Erasing meant they didn't register as human at all. After 3 hours, Alice couldn't take it anymore. Her entire body hurt. She was dizzy from heat and dehydration. Her feet were bleeding where the slippers had rubbed blisters. And she learned what she came to learn. The wealthy didn't see the poor as human. They saw them as obstacles or scenery or nothing at all. The answer to her question was definitive and crushing. But Alice had planned this experiment thoroughly, and the plan included a second location. She needed to move to a humbler neighborhood, a place where poverty and working-class life existed openly, to see if the pattern held across economic strata. So she limped away from Bonifacio Global City, feeling like she was escaping a beautiful prison, and caught a jeepney heading toward a neighborhood near Guadalupe. The jeepney ride was uncomfortable but revelatory. Passengers pressed together, bodies touching because there was no space for personal bubbles. Alice found herself squeezed between a woman holding a child and a young man in a construction worker's clothes. And something unexpected happened. These people didn't ignore her. They didn't treat her with kindness necessarily, but they acknowledged her existence. The woman with the child shifted slightly to give Alice more room. The construction worker said, "Excuse me," when his arm brushed against hers. Small courtesies, but after hours of invisibility in BGC, they felt like proof of life. Alice got off the jeepney near a busy intersection, close to a local market. This area was different from Bonifacio Global City in every way. The streets were narrower, more chaotic. Vendors lined the sidewalks selling vegetables and fish and household goods. The smell was different. Cooking food and diesel fumes and humanity pressed close together. The sound were different, louder, more urgent, more alive. And the people were different too. Here, poverty wasn't invisible. It was a default state. Most people here weren't wealthy. They were getting by, surviving, working hard for small gains. And in this environment, Alice discovered something unexpected. She wasn't invisible at all. People's eyes moved across her and registered her presence. They didn't stop to help, didn't offer assistance, but they saw her. She existed in their world in a way she hadn't existed in the world of wealth. Alice found a spot near a corner where several streets intersected. She sat down on the curb, no longer able to stand, and simply watched. A woman sweeping the street in front of her small store glanced at Alice and nodded slightly, acknowledgement between two people occupying the same social space. A group of children playing nearby ran past Alice, one of them saying, "Excuse me," as he nearly stepped on her foot. Even that, the politeness of a child, felt significant after the erasure she'd experienced in BGC. The heat was still brutal, and Alice's suffering was still real, but the quality of it had changed. In BGC, she'd been suffering while being erased, which created a special kind of psychological torture. Here, she was suffering but visible, which somehow made it more bearable. Humans, Alice realized, needed to be seen. Invisibility was its own kind of death. She'd been sitting on the curb for perhaps 45 minutes when she noticed a man approaching. He was thin, maybe 35 or 40, wearing a uniform that identified him as a street cleaner for the city. He carried a push broom and wore gloves. His face was weathered by sun and work. And as he swept his way down the street toward where Alice sat, she saw him looking at her, not glancing past, but actually looking, his eyes registering concern. Mark Storm stopped sweeping when he reached the corner where Alice sat. He stood there for a moment, leaning on his broom, studying her with an expression Alice couldn't quite read. She tensed, unsure what to expect. In her normal life, men sometimes looked at her, but those looks were usually calculating, assessing her wealth, her status, her usefulness. This man's look was different. He was seeing something in her that triggered a response Alice hadn't anticipated. Simple human concern. "Ma'am," he said in English, though his accent suggested Tagalog was his first language. "Are you okay?" The question surprised Alice so much she almost forgot her role. When was the last time someone had asked if she was okay? Not in a performative, polite way, but genuinely? She couldn't remember. People assumed she was okay because she was rich. They assumed wealth insulated you from not okayness. Alice started, then stopped, unsure how to answer. Her throat was dry and her voice came out raspy. "I'm very hot." Mark nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "It's a terrible day for heat," he said. He glanced around, then back at Alice. "Have you eaten?" The question was so unexpected, so direct, that Alice felt tears threatening again. She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Mark studied her for another moment, then made a decision. He propped his broom against a nearby wall and walked to a small food cart 20 feet away. Alice watched him, confused. He was talking to the vendor, gesturing, pulling something from his pocket. Money. He was giving the vendor money. For her. He returned carrying a plastic bag containing rice and chicken, still warm. The smell made Alice's stomach clench with sudden hunger. She realized she'd been so focused on her experiment she'd forgotten to eat breakfast, and it was now past 2 in the afternoon. But more than the hunger, she felt something else. Shock. This man, this stranger, was by her food. Mark held out the bag. "Here," he said. "You should eat." Alice took the bag with trembling hands. "I can't. I don't have money to pay you." "I'm not asking for payment," Mark said simply. He picked up his broom again, as if the transaction was complete and unremarkable. But Alice couldn't let it go. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why did you help me?" Mark looked at her with an expression that was patient and slightly puzzled, as if the answer should be obvious. "Because you're suffering," he said. "And I have a little extra today. Not much, but enough to share." The simplicity of his answer shattered something in Alice. She looked down at the plastic bag containing rice and chicken. Food this man had probably intended for his own lunch, or maybe for his children's dinner. Food that represented a meaningful portion of what little he had. And he'd given it to her, a stranger, because she was suffering. Alice had spent her entire adult life in a world where transactions were complex, where help came with strings attached, where generosity was strategic, where people gave in order to receive, calculated their donations for maximum tax benefit, donated to charities to be seen donating. She'd never encountered pure altruism before. She hadn't believed it existed. "Do you have children?" Alice asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. Mark's face softened. "Yes," he said. "Two. A boy and a girl. 7 and 5. And your wife?" "She passed away," Mark said quietly. 3 years ago. Cancer. We couldn't afford the treatments." He said this without bitterness, just stating a fact, the way he might describe the weather. Alice felt her carefully constructed emotional detachment crumbling completely. This man had lost his wife because he couldn't afford to save her. He was raising 2 children alone on a street cleaner's salary, which Alice knew was barely above minimum wage. He probably struggled every day to provide the basics: food, shelter, school fees. And yet he'd stop to buy food for a stranger he thought was suffering. "I'm sorry," Alice said, tears now running openly down her face, carving tracks to the dirt she applied so carefully. "I'm so sorry." Mark seemed uncomfortable with her emotion. "Don't cry, ma'am," he said gently. "Things are hard, but we survive. You'll survive too. Eat the food. Rest. Tomorrow will be different." He started to walk away, back to his work, as if what he'd done was nothing remarkable. But Alice couldn't let him leave. "Not yet. Not like this." "Wait," she said, her voice urgent. "What's your name?" He turned back, surprised. "Mark," he said. "Mark Storm." "Mark Storm," Alice repeated, committing it to memory. "Thank you. You don't know what you've done, but thank you." Mark smiled slightly, confused by the intensity of her gratitude, but accepting it. "You're welcome," he said. Then he walked away, pushing his broom, returning to work that would earn him barely enough to feed his children. Alice sat on the curb, holding the plastic bag, and crying. She cried for the cruelty of wealth, for the erasure she'd experienced in BGC, for the fact that this man with nothing had given her what people with everything had refused: recognition of her humanity. She cried because her experiment had succeeded too well, had shown her something she couldn't unsee. She opened the bag and looked at the rice and chicken inside. The portions were generous. This wasn't leftovers or scraps. Mark had bought her a full meal, the kind he would eat himself. She thought about how much this meal probably cost in relation to his daily wages. Maybe 10%, maybe 15%. He'd given her 15% of his daily income without hesitation, without expecting anything in return, simply because she was suffering and he could help. Alice did the math in her head. 15% of her daily income, her actual wealth accrual from investments and business operations, was roughly $8 million. She tried to imagine giving $8 million to a stranger on the street, no questions asked, just because they looked like they needed it. She couldn't. Even after everything she'd experienced today, she couldn't imagine that level of generosity. But Mark had done it. Not 8 million, but the equivalent in his own economy. He'd given sacrificially, generously, without hesitation. And in doing so, he'd answered Alice's question more definitively than any amount of time in Bonifacio Global City could have. The answer was this: humanity existed, but not where Alice had expected to find it. It didn't exist among the wealthy, who had so much they could afford to give without feeling it. It existed here, among people who had so little that giving meant sacrifice. Real generosity, Alice understood now, was measured not by the amount given, but by the cost of giving. The wealthy could drop thousands into charity and never notice. The poor gave what they needed themselves, and that made all the difference. Alice ate the rice and chicken slowly, tasting every bite, honoring the sacrifice it represented. The food was simple but good, and it filled the hunger that had been gnawing at her. But more than her physical hunger, it filled something else, a hollowness she'd been carrying for 45 years without knowing it. The hollowness of living in a world where nothing cost her anything, where generosity was always strategic, where human connection was always transactional. Mark Storm had given her a gift more valuable than anything her billions could buy: the gift of being seen, truly seen, as a human being worth helping. And Alice knew she would never forget it. The week after her experiment was the longest of Alice's life. She went through the motions of her business, meetings, decisions, negotiations, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about Mark Storm, about his thin face and patient eyes, about the way he'd handed her that bag of food, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She kept thinking about the question he'd raised without meaning to. What was she doing with her wealth? Alice had always considered herself a good person. She donated to charity, employed thousands of people, paid her taxes. She'd funded scholarships and built a wing at a children's hospital. But now she understood that all of that had been easy. Writing checks was easy when the checks didn't matter to your own survival. Real generosity was what Mark had shown, giving when giving hurt. She spent 3 days trying to locate him. Her security team was efficient, and with Mark's full name and general location, they found him quickly. He lived in a small apartment in Pasig with his 2 children, worked 6 days a week for the city sanitation department, and made 12,000 pesos per month, roughly $240. Less than Alice spent on a single dinner. The security report included photographs that made Alice's chest tighten. Mark's apartment was 1 room, maybe 200 square feet, with a hot plate for cooking and a shared bathroom down the hall. His children slept on mats on the floor. There were no toys visible in the photos, no decorations, nothing extra, just the absolute minimum required for survival. Alice learned that Mark's wife had died of cervical cancer, a treatable disease if caught early and if treatment was affordable. But treatment hadn't been affordable. They'd sold everything trying to save her, their small house, their furniture, Mark's motorcycle that he'd used to earn extra money doing deliveries. They'd gone into debt with relatives and loan sharks, and still hadn't been enough. She'd died, and Mark had been left with 2 small children, crushing debt, and a grief that never fully healed. The report also noted that Mark was behind on his rent and his children's school fees. He was at risk of eviction, and his daughter might have to drop out of school next semester. These facts were stated clinically in the security report, but Alice felt each one like a knife. This was the man who'd bought her lunch, the man who'd given what he couldn't afford to give. On the 7th day after her experiment, Alice returned to the corner where she'd met Mark. But this time she came as herself, Alice Larman, billionaire, wearing clothes that cost more than Mark made in 6 months. She arrived in her car, with her driver and her assistant, and she brought documents that would change Mark Storm's life forever. She found him in the early afternoon, sweeping the same stretch of street where they'd met. He didn't recognize her at first. Why would he? The woman he'd helped had been dirty and desperate. This woman was polished and powerful, clearly wealthy, clearly from a different world. But when Alice approached him and said his name, something in her voice made him look closer. His eyes widened. "Ma'am," he said, uncertain. "The woman from last week?" "Yes," Alice said, "though I looked different then." Mark stared at her, trying to reconcile the beggar he'd helped with this elegant stranger. "I don't understand," he said slowly. Alice took a breath. "I was conducting an experiment," she said, "testing whether people would help someone who appeared to need it. Most people didn't. But you did. You gave me your food, even though you could barely afford to." Mark's face went through several expressions: confusion, embarrassment, something that might have been anger. "It was a test," he said. "You were pretending?" "Yes," Alice admitted. "And I'm sorry for the deception. But I learned something that day that I needed to learn. You showed me what real generosity looks like." Mark set down his broom. "I don't want thanks," he said stiffly. "I helped because you looked like you needed help. That's all." "I know," Alice said. "That's exactly why I'm here." She gestured to her assistant, who came forward carrying a folder. "I'm here to give you something. Not as payment. You can't pay for what you gave me, but as recognition, as gratitude." She opened the folder and pulled out the first document. "This is a check for $250,000, she said, watching Mark's face carefully. "It's enough to pay off any debts, to cover your children's education through university, to give you a cushion against emergencies." Mark didn't reach for the check. He stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, clearly unable to process what he was hearing. Alice continued. "This is a deed to a 3-bedroom apartment in Capitolio," she said, pulling out another document. "It's not a mansion, but it's safe and comfortable. It has bedrooms for your children, a real kitchen, a bathroom that's yours alone. It's fully paid for. You own it. Mark's hands were shaking now. I can't. He started, but his voice failed. And this, Alice said, pulling out the final document, is a trust fund for your children's education. It will cover all school fees, books, supplies, uniforms, through university and beyond. They'll never have to drop out because you can't afford it. They'll never have to choose between school and eating. Alice held out the documents to Mark, but he didn't take them. He just stood there, tears running down his face, his body shaking with emotion he was trying to control. Why? He finally managed. Why are you doing this? Alice felt her own eyes filling with tears. Because you saw me when I was invisible, she said. Because you gave what you couldn't afford to give. Because you showed me that humanity isn't about how much you have. It's about what you do with what you have. You're the richest person I've ever met, Mark. And I wanted you to know that. Mark broke down completely then, covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Alice stepped forward and put the documents in his hands, closing his fingers around them. You don't have to thank me, she said quietly. You already gave me more than I'm giving you. You gave me back my faith in people. That's worth more than money. When Mark finally looked up, his face was transformed. The weariness that lined it, the resignation of someone who'd accepted that life would always be hard, was replaced by something else. Hope, possibility, relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. My children, he said, his voice breaking. They can stay in school. They can have real beds. They can eat every day without me worrying. Yes, Alice said. That's all true. Mark looked at the documents in his hands, then at Alice, then back at the documents, as if he couldn't believe they were real. I only gave you one meal, he said. One meal that cost maybe 50 pesos. And you're giving me a life. I don't understand. Alice smiled through her tears. That one meal taught me something I needed to learn. It taught me that generosity isn't about the amount, it's about the sacrifice. You gave me 15% of your daily wages without thinking twice. I'm giving you less than a fraction of a percent of my wealth. You're still more generous than me, Mark. You'll always be more generous. They stood there on that street corner. Two people from completely different worlds, connected by an act of kindness that had transformed them both. Around them, Manila continued its chaotic dance. Jeepneys honking, vendors calling, life pressing forward. But in that moment, Alice and Mark existed in a bubble of mutual understanding. What will you do now? Alice asked. Mark looked down the street toward where his apartment was, where his children were probably waiting for him to come home. I'll tell my children, he said slowly. I'll tell them that kindness matters, that helping people matters, that the woman I gave food to, she gave us everything. No, Alice corrected gently. You gave me everything. I'm just trying to return it. They parted ways then. Mark returned to his sweeping. He would work one more week to give proper notice, maintaining his dignity even in his sudden fortune. Alice returned to her car, to her penthouse, to her billionaire's life. But neither of them was the same person they'd been before. Alice went back to her office and called a meeting with her foundation board. She had plans to implement, programs to fund, systems to change. She'd learned that day on the streets that the wealthy needed to learn to see the poor, truly see them, as humans worthy of dignity and respect. She'd learned that generosity meant sacrifice, that real change required more than checkbooks, that humanity was measured not by what you had, but by what you gave when giving cost you something. Over the following months, Alice's life transformed. She still ran her company, still made billions. This response paused because Claude reached its max length for a message. Hit continue to nudge Claude along. Continue. This story teaches us that true generosity is measured not by the amount we give, but by the sacrifice it requires. Mark Storm, earning barely enough to feed his children, gave away a portion of his daily wages to help a stranger, while the wealthy in Bonifacio Global City gave nothing despite having abundance. The lesson is profound. Wealth doesn't guarantee humanity, and poverty doesn't diminish it. Real compassion exists in the willingness to see others as human beings worthy of dignity, regardless of their social status. Alice learned that invisibility is a choice the privileged make, and that authentic generosity means giving when giving costs you something. The story reminds us that we all have the power to see and help others, and that the smallest act of kindness from someone with little could be worth more than the largest donation from someone with everything. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. Kindly support what I do here by subscribing. And then drop in the comment section if you like part 2 of Alice and Mark's story. What will Alice do with her newfound understanding of humanity? How will Mark's life change with his new circumstances? Will Alice's transformation inspire other billionaires to see the invisible? Let me know if you want to hear more.